So I was reading this article today and I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, like this is terrible. Like, why are all these people dying? So you got this shooter, kill all these people, injured all these people. Boom, boom, boom. It's like all these examples, so many, and going through this timeline. But the thing I didn't see is an article actually describing, like, hey, here's why this is happening and here are the impacts. Okay. So I said, why is Chicago so violent? And why can't the police seem to catch all these shooters? Because what the article implied was uh, Chicago is super violent because the governor or the police are super incompetent. And I question that. I typically question if somebody's pointing fingers, right? It's probably because they have a bad strategy, they have a bad system. And so I asked AI to help me understand the strategic levers of this situation in Chicago. And what I found was fascinating. It says, this is a layered question. Let's cut straight through the noise. Okay. And what I was seeing in this article was noise. Okay. It was a bunch of recent examples, a big stack of anecdotes. Okay. And what I found when I looked into it was actually that there are fewer murders this year than last year. Year over year, I think we're doing really well in Chicago, in Illinois. And that was not pointed out in the article. And I don't think that Trump is reading the statistics of how much better this year we're doing compared to last year. There are some fuzzy things about the statistics that make it a little bit more difficult to understand. But overall, if we look at those statistical trends, if we just look at the data, we have a very different picture of what's going on compared to the headlines in the mainstream news. So let's look at some other data here, some other interesting insights that are not necessarily being discussed in all of the mainstream articles that you read. Number one, concentration of poverty and segregation. Chicago has some of the most segregated neighborhoods. Decades of redlining, deinvestment, and school closures left entire areas with few economic opportunities, violence clusters where poverty, unemployment, and lack of resources converge. So this is a long-standing issue. It's not just something that's like, this has gotten really bad this year. All of a sudden, what's going on? I don't know. This is very systemic, deep-rooted issue. Gang fragmentation. I had no idea about this. The old super gangs, and it gives some names of gangs here that I'm not going to read so I don't get banned from YouTube, fractured into hundreds of small neighborhood crews. That makes disputes more personal, unpredictable, and harder to mediate. Instead of large organized hierarchies, you have dozens of micro conflicts fueling shootings. Let's look at number three, retaliation culture. Many shootings are not about money, but about revenge and reputation. One killing sparks another, which creates cycles that are hard to break. This is intensified by social media feuds, which escalate violence instantly. And I will tell you, I have had two next door neighbors who were killed, shot in the head, and I have had a cross the street neighbor who was disappeared. And I also have lived in not Chicago, but Baltimore for 2 years. And I saw a massive amount of this back and forth retaliation thing happening. And it is absolutely like crazy. Just the angry feelings that just get bounced back and forth, back and forth. This retaliation culture, it's really all we need in order to have constant violence. And if you look at retaliation culture, it starts with this one thing. It starts with the fundamental attribution error, which says, oh, when I make a mistake, it's because of certain situations. But when other people make a mistake, it's because they are bad, the other, right? And so when we make the distinction and say, oh, those people over there, those others, they are bad. And they do these things because they are bad. Not, that is the opening of the door to all levels of violence. So this retaliation culture just is a perfect example of people not being trained how to think in terms of perspective taking. And they're doing the fundamental attribution error with every move they make. Number four, illegal gun flow. Chicago has strict local gun laws. You'd think that would solve the problem, right? But surrounding states, especially Indiana and Wisconsin, have looser rules. Guns cross borders easily. Studies show the majority of crime guns that were recovered in Chicago come from out of state sources. Okay, so let's look at these reasons why police struggle to catch shooters. Number one, low clearance rates. And if you don't know what a clearance rate is, it basically means that they caught the person or the person was killed in the catching part. Chicago's homicide clearance rate hovers around 50% or lower, sometimes as low as 30 to 40% in certain years. National average is about 60 to 65%. And here are the reasons. Witnesses fear retaliation. So this goes back to the retaliation culture. So this is exactly the kind of thing that we should think through. If you're thinking about that diagnosis, Richard Rumelt diagnosis, what is the biggest problem here? What is the root cause? And we can look at this as a potential root cause. Witnesses fear retaliation and think, okay, well, that's one of the big problems. And the whole retaliation culture, right? That retaliation is okay. It is the rule of thumb. It's the standard, right? And when retaliation is the standard and that's a cultural value, then that creates an ongoing spiraling problem. So people don't come forward because testifying can get you killed. That is potentially a fundamental building block. So when you're building your strategy and you're trying to think through what are the potential problems to look at, like what are the potential problems that we could address, that we could potentially address, it's good to make a list of what you think, what your leadership team thinks are the worst problems. And then to, talk about, well, why is that potentially a problem? And what is potentially underneath this? Are there other things that are deeper that are causing this? And that's where we would potentially want to go in order to have an effective strategy. Distrust of police. Communities often feel over-policed, yet under-protected, which reduces cooperation. Over-policed, yet under-protected. And this we will talk about more in a moment. Volume cases. Hundreds of homicides and thousands of shootings annually stretch investigators thin. Each detective carries multiple major cases at once, far and above best practice levels. And if you think about those best practice levels and think about being agile and lean and Six Sigma and thinking about small batch sizes being a key ingredient to increase throughput, then that is a very interesting problem to have when your queue line becomes too long. When you have too larger batches, that is a recipe for failure every time. So this is another thing we could look at and say, what can we do in order to decrease the number of cases that each detective carries at once? And that allows for a faster solve to happen. Okay. And it's just when you look at this thing strategically, like all of a sudden you have some clear options here. And that's what we want is we want to use AI and use our other brain there to help our main brain to figure out, okay, what are the possible options here on the table? And we can look at those and then make a more informed judgment. Number 3, technology versus reality. Chicago invested in shot spotter sensors. And I believe they identify the location of when a shot is fired, when a gun is fired, surveillance cameras and data analytics. But tech doesn't replace human cooperation. You can know where the shot happened, but without a witness or evidence, cases stall. And why was that? It was because of this fear of retaliation, the retaliation culture. Ooh, root cause. Okay. So where were we? Fragmented gangs equals fragmented crime. With no central gang leadership, there's no single group police can negotiate with or dismantle. Every block crew has its own conflicts, making prevention and investigation diffuse. Oh my goodness. Looking at this problem, you might say, maybe we need larger gang structures. Maybe we need more order, more organization in our crime units. I don't know that that's the solution, but it is what it is currently. And this is a very interesting point to note, right? So for the governor and the mayor and people looking in on this situation, people advising them, they might think, like, what is happening here with the gangs? Why is this situation like it is? What is the landscape? What do we know? What do we not know? And how do these smaller gang units or smaller pieces, how do these smaller groups act differently than large groups? And how do we interact with them differently than we would with large groups? Clearly, they don't have a great effective strategy of dealing with these smaller groups. If they did, then perhaps there wouldn't be such a big issue right now. And again, the thing that we can come back to is it such a big issue right now? Or is it perhaps better than it has been in past years? And if you look at the statistics, it's a little bit tricky because there are different denominators when you look at the different ratios. But by appearances, when you look at those numbers, they seem to have come down this year. Down, which is interesting to note because we have a lot of people like, oh my goodness, this is a huge problem. And Trump is threatening to send in the National Guard. And studies show that if they send in the National Guard for like large civil unrest issues, then that can be effective. But when it's sent in to deal with crime, then that's has not shown to be as effective in the past. And my source for that is ChatGPT. So check on that. But this is an important thing to know, how often it works well and what working well looks like and what outcomes are desired and what it looks like when it fails and why it often fails. And so if we look at those strategic drivers, we can make a much better decision. Let's look at 3 particular strategic errors that it brought up. First, overemphasis on arrests, underinvestment in prevention. Suppression strategies, raids, sweeps do not stop retaliations or address root causes. Prevention programs like credible messengers, youth outreach, and job creation are consistently underfunded compared to policing. This is fascinating because I have 2 next door neighbors who were shot in the head. I've had one across the street neighbor who was disappeared, and I've known many others who lost a loved one in a shooting and this back and forth retaliation culture, right? And this is so real and it is in the culture itself, right? And so this idea of prevention and in addressing the cultural issues instead of just, driving the ambulance to the bottom of the cliff, all these people are hurt. You can go to the top of the cliff, right? And say, why are these people falling off the cliff? And address those issues through prevention. It's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Secondly, short political cycles versus long violent cycles. I've heard this phrase, you heard this something like, person who can think the longest term will win, right? And that's true probably in financial investments. That's probably true in fighting crime. Mayors and police chiefs rotate every few years. Each new leader wants a fresh strategy, so consistent long-term solutions rarely stay. Terrible. I think a great strategy with great implementation is something that has built-in guardrails and structure that can continue throughout the years, right? So if you think of something that's really great and it works for 2 or 3 years, that's wonderful. But if the thing breaks down and is done as soon as you leave office, then obviously your impact is very limited. Number 3, community trust deficit. Decades of misconduct, scandals, eroded public trust. Without legitimacy, police can't get the cooperation needed to solve crimes. And as we discussed before, prevention, it just is the thing because police, when they go and they do the youth outreach, for example, and the police are connecting with the youth and providing mentorship and giving presentations and building them up and inspiring them and encouraging them, then that breaks down that wall. One thing that we have that is really interesting with us humans, psychologically, we have this fundamental attribution error. And all humans do this. And the fundamental attribution error is when we say, oh, well, when I make a mistake, when I do something wrong, it's because of my situation. It's because of my circumstances. Couldn't help it. But when someone else does something wrong or does something that we perceive as wrong, we say, oh, well, that is because they are a bad person. Yeah, they are a monster. They are less than human. And that is what causes this letting ourselves off the hook in order to treat someone less than. And so the fundamental attribution error is at the heart of violence, is at the heart of the retaliation culture. Because we say, oh, they did a bad thing and they are a bad person. Therefore, I can do whatever that it takes in order to punish that person because I am always right. That's at the heart of what fuels it. So just teaching what this is, teaching this thing of the us, them that goes down that slippery slope to young people. I think that is one of the incredible things that we can do in prevention. I am not a political scientist. I am not an expert in these things, but I've had a few personal experiences and I know how to look things up and get some insights. And is this all the insights? No. Is this everything that's needed to solve the issue? No. But I think that overall, as we find ourselves in opportunities to make decisions by querying ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, other LLMs, that Gemini, that we can find the right levers to look at and to investigate and to fact check and find out, is this year really worse than last year? Is this a long-term trend? Is this potentially caused by forces that are more complex than just kicking down doors and cuffing people? Is it things that we can address in a more long-term prevention-oriented effort? And the bottom line here, it says, is Chicago's violence is not because of one bad mayor, one bad police department, one bad policy. It's the cumulative effect of structural poverty, fractured gangs, easy gun flow, cycles of retaliation, and a weak trust in institutions. Police can't catch all the shooters because solving murders requires community trust and cooperation. And right now, that trust is fractured. So I think that's true. When you're solving your next problem, you might think through, okay, what are the pieces of this? And even if you don't have lots of news articles to draw on, as this topic did, you may have transcripts from meetings. You may have past strategic documents. You may have reviews from your website, customer reviews that you can go query and say, oh, tell me about this problem. Query the customer reviews and give me some data on them. You can have AI do a lot of gathering and synthesizing and analysis and bringing together those themes to you so that you can look at these strategic levers and figure out what are the main problems that we could potentially address, which one or two are most solvable, what are our guiding policies, how are we going to go about solving them in a way that is resource appropriate, in a way that is sustainable, and in a way that will be effective. And how can we test that out in a very short period of time to find out and pivot if we're potentially off? And number three, what are the exact action items that will be cohesive and complement each other in that strategy? And that's the Richard Rumelt strategy kernel right there. But I encourage you to use your tools, do the research, and get some help in bringing together those pieces of your strategy kernel in your next strategic planning activity. I'm Tyler Small, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey, Tyler from the future here. I just wanted to mention something that the results from ChatGPT, I think ChatGPT 5 is a little less sycophantic than the previous versions. And some people like it a lot less because of that. You've seen a lot of the rage about ChatGPT 5, perhaps. But one thing I saw in there as I did my additional fact checking afterwards was a difference in statistics. And I just wanted to point out, sycophancy is the behavior of excessively flattering, praising, or agreeing with someone, usually someone in power, in order to gain favor, avoid conflict, or secure personal advantage. And this is a very interesting thing that LLMs often do in order to gain favor and really stay on your good side. They'll tell you what you want to hear. So when you ask a question like, why is Chicago so violent? It'll tell you, what you want to hear essentially. And so it's important to ask additional questions and say, wait a minute, is Chicago so violent? And so that's one of the follow-up questions I ask. And what I came up with is this fact sheet from the Office of the Mayor This is a press release, and the clearance rate that you saw in what it said, oh, something around 40 or 50%, something like that. And it said that it was hovering around that, but that may be a historical figure. It may not have anything to do with the current situation. Currently, this year, and I've noticed another thing about LLMs and their weaknesses, unless you ask for, this year, like year over year from 2025, 24, like looking at that difference, unless you specify that, it doesn't really understand that you're talking about what's happening right now. Oftentimes the statistics that it comes up with are a few years old. And so that's nice if you're dealing with something where the current realities aren't important. And I can't think of a good example of that. But the current reality right now, according to this report from the mayor's office of Chicago, is that the clearance rate is actually 77.4%, which is substantially higher than the national average. And then I mentioned some of these statistics, most recent year-to-date statistics, overall violent crime down by 21.6%, homicides down by 32.3%, overall shooting incidents down by 37.4, multi-victim shooting incidents down by 44.6. These statistics are demonstrating progress, improvement, and increasing effectiveness of whatever their strategy is right now. So there has been a lot of effort and intentional action put into place, and it seems to be working. So well done, Mayor Brandon Johnson, for your work there. And of course, I would double check this further. If it was, my strategic area, I would go and look at the police records and scrutinize those further. But according to this report, it tells a very different story than a lot of the articles and videos that you'll see saying, oh, it's so violent. And you see a lot of individual stories that are anecdotal. And for example, one of the videos I watched had several people saying they were in their kind of middle age, and they said, oh yeah, like this is much worse than it used to be. I grew up here and things were never like this. And now, 8-year-olds are carrying guns around and shooting each other. And I don't know how factually accurate that is as far as a trend, right? And so I like to look at trends. I like to look at percentages year over year, decade by decade, things like that. And it tells a very different story than individuals kind of looking around and seeing what they see. I think that individual experiences are very critical and important to consider. And also we need to weigh that and balance it against facts and the statistics that exist. And back to you, Past Tyler.